My guest is presenting her new book, Eli's Story, a 20th Jewish Life, which tells the story of a man whose life and memory spanned 2 world wars, several migrations, an educated odyssey, and a massive disruption of the Holocaust. I'm joined by its author, Dr. Meri-Jane Rochelson. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Dr. Rochelson, this is a story about your father who survived the Holocaust.
Yes.
Now, considering your educational background, how important is the story to you?
Oh, it's extremely important. I think it's regardless of my educational background, I think it's a story that people need to know. I decided to tell this story not just about my father's Holocaust experience, which of course was critical, and everything kind of pivots on that.
Absolutely.
But the subtitle is A 20th-Century Jewish Life because it covers his entire life. He was born in Kovna, Lithuania in 1907, and he died in Brooklyn, New York in 1984. And people are aware of the Holocaust.
Yes.
A lot of young people are not very aware of the Holocaust, but they think of it as a time of death and destruction of people long ago and far away. One of the things that this book shows was that the victims of the Holocaust were people just like us.
And they lived actual lives.
They lived actual modern lives. At one point in the interview on which this is based, an interview that was done by my brother with my father in the 1970s, at one point in the interview, my father mentions his phone number.
Wow.
And yes, I know. I remember thinking, oh my God, they had a phone number. Well, of course they had a phone number. The time he was talking about was 1941. Absolutely. These were modern people living modern lives. My father had just graduated from medical school the year before. He had a young son. He had a wife. They didn't survive. He had a brother who had a wife and child. None of them survived.
Now, your father survived the Holocaust, of course. Mm-hmm. And like you mentioned, his family didn't survive. Was it hard for you to understand his life and pain?
That's a really interesting question. I think so. I mean, I think it had to be. But my father told us a lot about his life throughout the time I was growing up. There were some really important things that he didn't tell us and that I didn't find out till I was a teenager, such as he had a wife and a child. And I talk about finding out about that in this book. But we knew that he came from Europe. We knew that his family had died. And he talked about the persecution. So from the time I was very young, I knew that he had come out of a difficult situation before I was born, but then again, I knew so little about life that I guess, okay, you know, I just kind of understood it. But I remember one thing that I point out is that in the New York City subways, they had these signs about, you know, no spitting, violators will be prosecuted. Mm-hmm. And I thought it said violators will be persecuted, and I thought you could be killed for spitting in the subway. Oh my God. So that's a sign of what I knew when I was quite young.
Now, I understand that you did research for this book through public archives as well as personal archives.
Yes.
But the core of Eli's story is in his own words.
Yes, it is.
How did you get that information?
Okay. Well, in the mid-1970s, around the time that my brother, Bert Rochelson, graduated from college, he sat my father down and interviewed him and taped the interviews. My father wanted his story to be told. He told us all the time we were growing up, he wanted his story to be a book. So my brother sat with him, and I think it was 6 hours of interviews, which I then transcribed just recently. One of the things that surprised me when I transcribed it was that there was actually very significant information in the interview, which I had heard in the 1970s when I first heard the tapes. that I had forgotten completely.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you learn any new experiences that your father may have gone through during the research?
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, I learned, this was actually from other materials that we had. We had this diary and letters in German.
Oh, wow.
And I don't go into this in great detail in the book because I really don't know very much about it. But it seems that when my father helped to form the DP Camp Hospital, the Hospital for Displaced Persons at Landsberg am Lech, which was a very large displaced persons camp in Bavaria. And he worked with a doctor named Dr. Solomon Nabrisky, and they set up this hospital. And my father was in charge of the outpatient division. While he was there, he had a relationship with a German nurse who was working there. And my brother had those letters in that diary translated by someone he knew who knows German. And we looked at these and we thought, this is interesting. But we didn't know enough to really go into it in great detail. And that's a story that my brother might work on sometime. Right, exactly. So I don't go too far on it in this book. Other things I learned, this is one of the things I learned that I should have known when listening to the interviews, that my father's mother-in-law, the mother of his wife who was killed, survived. And it was in the interview, and I somehow never processed it until I found her letters. And there were these desperate letters from her that she sent to my uncle, who lived in New York, who came in 1912, asking, you know, do you have any information about my son? She called him my son. And my grandson and my daughter, do you know anything about them? Are they alive? And in other letters, she wrote about dreams she had that her grandson was at the door, things like this. That was all completely new to me. I also learned while doing research, and this was not in the interview material, this was by making contact from another person who was a child in the Kovna ghetto with my first brother, Borya. I knew that Borya had gone to Dachau with my father, Eli, and I knew that at a certain point he was taken away. That was all I knew. Wow. What I found out, though, from a man named Shalom Eilati, who has also written a wonderful book called Crossing the River about his experiences, was that there were actually 131 boys from Kovna who were taken together from Dachau to Auschwitz. And they were kept alive for about 6 weeks. There is various speculation on why. Most of them were killed. Some survived, I think about 30 or so survived, 40 maybe.
How important is it to educate the society about the Holocaust so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past?
Well, that's why it's important, so that we don't prevent the mistakes, so that we don't perform the mistakes of the past again. And in this day and age, when we're thinking so much about immigration, if American immigration laws had been more favorable, many of the people who were killed in the Holocaust would not have been killed. They would be Americans today. And I think of that when I hear all the news today about immigration, how my father and his family tried very hard to come to this country, and yet the barriers were there, and they couldn't. So it's very, very important to know these stories and make sure that this kind of horror never takes place in the world again. And unfortunately, to a certain extent, it has happened in places like Rwanda and places like Cambodia. And we have to be alert to it. We can't just say, this isn't my people. We're all our people.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. Remember that the 35th Miami Book Fair begins Sunday, November 11 and ends with the Weekend Street Fair extravaganza beginning Friday, November 16th until Sunday, November 18th. This is an event for the entire family.